Welcome back to Making Moves, the official podcast for the Center of Sport and Social Justice at Cal State East Bay. I'm your student rep and co-host, Andrea Corrigan. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And today's episode is both timely and essential, and for some, really controversial. We can agree that we are in a pivotal moment in history amongst many that have happened in our lifetime, where the arenas of sport, identity, and politics are colliding in a really visible way as trans athletes and advocates continue to face exclusion and politicization. The question we're posing on today's episode is not whether trans people belong in sport, but what does it mean to truly make space for everybody? What does that look like actually played out? This episode features a powerful conversation hosted by Bonta Sumii with two leaders in this fight for equality. The first is Kaig Lightner, a coach, educator, and founder of both the Portland Community Football Club and Quantum Gender Consulting. The second is Frankie de la Cretaz, a journalist and co-author of Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League. Together, they're exploring what inclusion really looks like, the cultural resistance to trans visibility in sports, and how inclusive minds are envisioning the future of sports participation for everybody. This is about more than policy. It's about humanity's complexity, community healing, and giving ourselves space to challenge our own ideas and beliefs about others. Let's dive in with Lisa.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea, for that really thorough and fantastic, impressive introduction of both Frankie and Kaig. We are about to get into some talking about this very important topic. It's a pleasure to be here with both you, Frankie, and Kaig. I'm excited to tap your wealth of knowledge and experience in the trans sport space. Let's get to it. So we know in a matter of weeks ago, there are new executive orders from the Trump administration that have changed how transgender athletes can participate in sport across many, many levels. In both of your experiences, how do you feel about that and the people around you and the communities that you interact with and belong to? How is that impacting the transgender people as a whole, but in sports as trans athletes? Frankie, what comes to mind when I bring that up?
So I'm a journalist, so I come at this from really what's actually true point of view, because, the Trump administration's executive order actually had no teeth, meaning it couldn't actually do anything. But what we saw in response was that the NCAA changed their policy. And then shortly after that happened, this federal bill that would have banned trans women and girls from playing in girls' sports actually didn't pass. It's dead. And so the NCAA prematurely changed a policy to comply with an executive order that they didn't have to comply with, and then the legislation didn't even pass. So, legally, there actually is no federal ban on women and girls, trans women and girls playing women's sports. So what you see happen is these reactionary responses from sports leagues or international and national governing bodies. And I think that is the other thing that makes a lot of this very confusing, because we have seen this conversation about trans inclusion in sport get very flattened. So we're talking about an 8-year-old trans girl in the same conversation that we're talking about a potential Olympian or an elite athlete.
Right.
And the thing is that those are wildly different things with different governing bodies and different policies and different laws and different bills. And it all gets very flattened. And so what happens is very confusing. People don't know what's actually true, or at what level or in what state or wherever they are. You don't actually know what's real. And so the reaction to that, I think, has been a lot of blanket bans that maybe didn't need to happen, or that people assume are in place that really aren't. And so I think for me as a journalist, what I'm seeing is a lot of confusion and a lot of really misunderstanding what is actually kind of happening for the community.
That's so important. And I love the word flattened. There's so many follow-up questions I have for you as a journalist from your perspective. But Kaig, I want you to have a chance. What is your just response, thoughts, comments from your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think from my side, as being somebody who's, in the community-based work as a soccer coach, as a social worker, as just sort of really rooted in what's going on with people on the ground within my own, close community, my friends, my trans friends, just fear, just stress, anxiety as a whole, right? As a general whole of executive orders and actions that have been put forth against the trans community in general. And then when it comes down to specifically in sport, unfortunately, there were already policies that I was seeing locally within the Portland, Oregon area, when I was running Portland Community Football Club, that there was already policies being put in place that were restricting kids from being able to play on the team that was aligned with their gender identity. And Portland Community Football Club is a club that has all gender inclusive teams. And so we were the place that families were finding as a place to come and have their kids play on a team that is open to anybody playing together. And so I was hearing stories already starting 2-3 years ago saying, hey, my kid's getting turned away because their birth certificate has this letter on it and they want to play on this team. And the leagues and the associations are saying, sorry, we don't do anything to adjust for that. Your child's going to have to play on, the boys team, which is typically what we're talking about with a kid who's assigned male at birth. And so this then kind of elevating to now it's a federal message. And Frankie's right. There's no law here. There's nothing actually happening. There's nothing that's actually legally changed. But that doesn't seem to matter because the messaging, the direction that the conversation has moved towards is so harmful and so pejorative towards the trans community that people don't seem to even know that they can say this is legal or not. They're just like, this is what's happening because the federal government is saying that it's happening.
Right.
So it's really dangerous. It's an incredibly dangerous time for kids who are trans, for adults who are trans. I'm maintaining a pretty low profile these days. I've had a higher profile, and I was just asked to interview in a major publication. I won't say who because I chose to keep my name out of it. But I had to tell that reporter, hey, you can't print my name. It's dangerous. I can't. In major publications that are going to be seen nationally or internationally. So that's the vibe that's going on, I think, with what kind of mixed with what Frankie was saying of like, here's what the facts are.
Yeah. And I think what's really important, and I want to add to what you're saying, Kaig, because you're talking about, we've seen some of this stuff happening even a few years ago. And now we've gotten to the point that trans people are afraid and there is a real danger and you're thinking about how you want your name in national publications. And what happened here, I want to say, is that these anti-trans sports bills that were passed in, I think it's, 26-ish states right now, those were really the first anti-trans bills that we started to see. And, I don't know if people remember in 2016, there was what was known as the bathroom bill in North Carolina, where they were trying to ban people from using bathroom that didn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And the NCAA in that moment actually pulled their championships out of the state. And the bill, failed. And these right-wing lobbyists and lawmakers went away and said, well, that didn't work. Villainizing trans people in this way did not work. And so sport became the place that they targeted because it is rooted in ideas of fairness in a way that I think it seems like to a lot of people who don't really know a lot about this, it seems like a quote unquote reasonable form of discrimination. But these anti-trans sports bills have been gateway bills. And so what's happened is when you make a group of people a threat in one area, it becomes a lot easier to make them a threat in other areas. So the anti-trans sports bills passed first, and then we saw the healthcare bans, and then we saw the bathroom bans, and then we see the education and school bans, and it has expanded to the point that trans people are completely, under attack in this country. But the sports was where it started, and a lot of people ignored that legislation because they were like, well, it's just sports. Who cares? But this is why it mattered. It actually opened the door to the discrimination on this much wider scale.
And two things I think to follow up on that is that, one, we have to go back even a little bit before 2016 and when gay marriage was legalized, and that this is ultimately the backlash as I see it, I think Frankie probably agree. This is the backlash of that being approved by the Supreme Court, and that the right side of the political spectrum looking at that and saying, okay, well, we didn't win there. Where's our next target? How can we pull people along into our base and make sure that our values and our ideals and ideology that are anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ can be rectified and resignated? And they went to trans people, right? And they started doing market research and looking at what are the words, what are the concepts, what are the phrases that we can sell to our base. And it was trans and kids, right? It was everything in that ideology of hate and discrimination. And of course, when you pin it as, like you said, Frankie, this like seemingly thing about fairness, and it's about kids getting a fair shot to play soccer sports. Soccer.
Right. That's okay. No.
Sports in general. But especially when you start interlacing it with the idea of girls and women getting less access, now you've got just this like salivating moment for people who are like, this is about women's fairness. This is about, we care about women's sports. I would love to know if any of those politicians who said we care about women's sports have ever watched a women's sports event.
Right.
Sports up until this moment. Maybe they do now. Maybe they're interested now. But that part is the most irritating and upsetting part to me, is that there's suddenly this care about something that actually has been a struggle for decades, 50, 60, 70 years. And now trans people are being pitted at the center of it. And the baseline of sport, the foundation of sport, is rooted in masculinity. It is an environment. It is a practice. It is an entertainment that was built by and for men. And so the measuring stick that we have for sport is masculinity, and it is men. And so we don't have a crisis of gender ideology in this country. We have a crisis of male fragility that's happening right now. We have men in our country who are looking at this and saying, I'm getting left out. I don't have a place in sport. I'm getting pushed out, or we're trying to include men into women's sports. It's blowing up the idea of what masculinity is meant to be in our country based on what gender binary says are the rules. That is the problem that we have right now. And it's so ingrained in sport, and it's so rooted in sport, that it's changing people's mindset about sport is not just about masculinity, and masculinity is not just about bigger, better, faster, stronger. We have to be able to adjust our idea of what masculinity can or should or is allowed to be. And in sport, I think that's the most difficult place to do it, because it's just built into our brains. It was built into my brain as a kid. I thought, as a young trans, gender fluid girl that was trying to be looking and feeling like a boy, I was like, I'm going to strut around and be this big, tough kid. That's what I thought it meant to be an athlete. And so that's really where I see the crux of this issue relying. And we've got to start adjusting and changing our language around that.
I think that's such an interesting point, because I think something that a lot of people don't consider is trans women and girls have been competing in sport for years. They've been allowed to compete in the Olympics since 2003. There wasn't one until the 2020 games, but this has always been accepted. But what has happened is trans women, trans athletes are allowed to compete until they start winning, right? And then they become a problem and they become a threat to the status quo. Mm-hmm. And if you actually look at the history of how many sports became sex segregated, it actually happens when women beat men and then they make a women's division. It is rooted in this idea of male fragility. And you can go back to the turn of the 20th century and figure skating for an example of that. Or you can go much more recently and look at the Barcelona Olympics, where a woman won one of the rifling events, and they had always been integrated. They were co-ed events. A woman set an Olympic record and won gold. And the next year, they separated the divisions. Not only that, she had to prematurely retire because there wasn't a women's division until the year 2000, almost a decade later. And so a lot of this is similar, is you see a challenge to the cultural ideas of power and hierarchy and the status quo as we know it. And I think we're seeing something similar happen with trans athletes now.
I want to add to what I said to make sure that it's really clear. When I say there's an issue with male fragility, I know that anyone who's listening to this who is male socialized, who is a cisgender man, thank you for listening. I'm glad you're here. And I want you to hear me say that is not to be shaming of the experience of being a man. I think that is part of the conversation that has to happen right now. And that's the conversation I want to start to be engaging with men around, is that to be fragile and to have emotion and to be feeling things that you feel upset and angry, and to hear somebody say, oh, this is male fragility, that isn't meant to shame men. That isn't meant to say, men, you are bad. You are doing something bad. You are inherently bad, because that message that keeps getting pushed into male socialized areas and communities, that message is then men pushing back and saying, no, you're blaming me and I don't like it. And we keep doing this back and forth, right? And so what I want to start infusing into this conversation, especially around sports, is the idea of empathy for what it means to be a male socialized person in the binary, right? The binary is the issue here. The binary has the rules, and it is what is dictating how we think we all should act and play and perform in sport. And so I really am wanting to try to start to change the conversation around gender equity that involves men and boys being a part of the conversation and a part of the solution. So, because I know when I say male fragility, right, there's just this feeling of like, oh, no.
Well, it's such a good point. And I think people feel defensive instead of maybe recognizing that sometimes when we use these words, what we're actually critiquing are the systems that uphold these dynamics and not the individual people. Because I don't know every man in the world. I don't know who's listening to this. And it's not a critique of someone as an individual. It's a critique of the larger systems that uphold the inequities and that marginalize certain people that, based on identity.
And when we look at sport, Lisa, I know you want to jump in here with another.
No, I don't. Y'all keep talking. I don't need to say a darn thing. Y'all keep talking.
And when you look at sport, who's leading sport? Who are at the top of running major sports leagues and clubs and organizations from youth to pro? Majority of them are men. And we know why. We don't need to go through the reasons why that's happening. But if this is truly going to start to shift and become, sport as a experience is going to become a place where everybody can actually find themselves and see themselves in the sport, then the leaders at the top who have the most power, who have the most privilege to make decisions and to do things differently, those people have to hear this message in a way that they see themselves in the change as well. And I think that's been part of the challenge of this, is that, in oppressive systems, the ability to reason with the oppressors, and, there is oppression going on here, the ability to reason with the oppressors often has to come from those who are oppressed. And not everybody who is oppressed in the binary system of sport should be the people to address the oppressors. If you've been harmed, if you've been sexually abused, if you've been discriminated against, if you've had a number of traumas, those are not the people that I expect to step up and take that mantle. I'm not one of those people. I've recovered from a tremendous amount of trauma. And I'm somebody who wants to sit in those rooms with those men and say, this is what's happening. This is how this could be changed. But it takes courage to hear that message. And I think that instead, what's been happening for all of these decades is that women and girls, female socialized people, right? When I say female socialized people, that means that includes people of all gender identities who've been socialized female. I'm a female socialized person, right? But I look like a man. Everybody assumes I'm a man. But those of us who've been female socialized, we tried to like basically push back against all this male socialization and all this masculinity and all this patriarchy. And instead of being able to be brought into it and integrated into it, we were given a slice. And that's what Title IX was, right? Like, here's a slice of sports. This is for you. This is your section. Okay, we men will keep going on in our direction and we'll take a bigger chunk of the pie. Here's your tiny slice of the pie. And so what you're still seeing happening now is hundreds of programs out there across the country that are for women and girls to get more access to sport. And I've been starting to track them. I've been starting to keep track of how many programs I come across that are just trying to get more access for women and girls. And it's just continuing to create this is the slice of the pie within the larger pie, as opposed to an integrated system.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why that integrated system has been so challenging to create is because men and boys are still seeing that they have the bigger slice of the pie. Even if they want to integrate, they don't know how, right? Because it's built into the system. So,
yeah, Title IX, which is celebrated, right, as this thing that did so much for women and girls in sport, actually codified sex segregated sport into law and has made it so much harder to challenge the existing structure. And what has happened, as Kaig is referring to, is like there's this scarcity mindset, right? And so what anti-trans rhetoric has done really well is pitted cis women and girls against trans women and girls and trans athletes, because they, I think cis women and girls already feel like they have so little in the world of sport, and this is all they have. And when you pit these two groups against each other, cis girls and trans girls, you splinter them, and you actually stop anyone from fighting the real enemy, which is the patriarchal system that has all of this in place. And I think, just like Kaig is talking about how men have to be part of this conversation, I also think that we need cis women and girls to realize, as soon as they realize that actually their own access and their own safety and their own freedom is actually tied up with trans women and girls, and they realize that this is the same struggle that they need to fight together, I think that is also where we're going to start to see change. Because once you start policing what a woman is and what it means to be a woman, now you are actually jeopardizing everybody. Because if you are someone who doesn't look feminine enough, if you are someone whose gender is called into question, especially if you are, Black or brown, which is historically who a lot of these exclusionary policies have impacted the most, you now have all kinds of girls who are, maybe even there are some bills that say they should have genital exams to see if they can participate in sports, a human rights abuse. So we can see, right, we have these advocates who are really trying to root out sexual abuse in sports, then pushing for mandatory genital exams for children. I don't understand it, but I think it's really important to kind of connect how these two groups actually need to be fighting together, because both their access and their safety are really part of the same fight. And the anti-trans groups have been so effective at splintering them and making them feel like they're actually opposed to one another. And that has been, the other thing I think that's really important here too, because we talk about what's fair. And I think you hear that a lot. And that has to do with this scarcity mindset. What's fair? And I think we can have a whole conversation about just even what that means. But I think we're asking the wrong question, because often this is framed as what's fair to who? What's fair to me? I think when you ask what's fair, you should always be centering the most marginalized people in the room with that question. And those are the people whose needs need to come first. And instead, what we do is, instead of saying, well, is it fair for the trans athletes who are being excluded because of their identity? We're saying, well, is it fair for these cis athletes who might have some feelings about having to compete against a trans person? We're human rights versus maybe some bad feelings. These aren't the same things. And we're weighting actually the feelings much higher than we are the actual discrimination. And so I think even just recentering the entire conversation is something that is going to really need to happen.
Yeah, I totally agree, Frankie. And this idea of fairness, sport is inherently unfair. That is part of sport. If we all entered into a sport competition knowing this is going to be completely fair and everyone is going to play at exactly the same level, well, then it's not any fun. In my opinion, there's no competition. There's no trying to excel into a new space. I said to all of you before we started recording, I was on the University of Washington women's rowing team as a 5'5" person. I didn't know you had to be tall for that sport. I didn't know sport. And I walked in and I'm competing against women who are 5'8" at the shortest level up to 6'3". And I saw that as a challenge and was like, great. And this is all pre-testosterone, right? I didn't have any advantage of extra, of that magical thing called testosterone that everybody thinks is the end all be all of a sport body. And I found my way, working my way up to the number one team as a novice, and went to the NCAA championships as somebody who'd never rowed before and was disadvantaged in every way. And I bring that story up because that was all about my mentality as an athlete, my competitive spirit, my inherent ability to train at that level. That's just a part of who I am. That's just a part of my physique and my mentality. And that's what when we talk about sport, we've got to talk about the fact that everybody has a different body. And every sport is different. And so when you said earlier, Frankie, this like flatline approach, right? That's the biggest problem, is that this is just being absolutely blanketed across all sport and all kinds of competition and all ages. And it's just not nuanced in any way. And one thing I want to add to this, and then I'll turn it back over to you all, is I just recently learned about something called biobanding. Are either of you familiar with this? I learned about it at a Project Play Summit a few weeks ago. This is an idea that's been working on for the last 5 or so years. U.S. hockey is looking at it. Basically, it's taking the idea of kids at a certain age, usually around, prepubescent, pubescent area, are at different levels of maturity, right? Some are tall, some are short, some are a little bit beyond in all kinds of ways. And then so instead of putting all the 12-year-olds on one team and saying, okay, you're all the same. And now it's looking at, okay, you're a 12-year-old, but you are still growing. You're still kind of trying to figure out your coordination. You're at this level of maturity. All of you are in that same kind of biological maturity area. You're going to play on one team together. And everybody who's a little bit more advanced, you're going to play on one team together, but you're all the same age. And so when I heard about that, I asked directly to the researchers who were talking about it, does this include trans folks? Like, is this looking at trans kids? Because this is a great way to look at athleticism in a different kind of way that's not specific to gender or just age. And they said, no, it doesn't include trans
It's not.
people. Right?
What? Like, why would you think it would? Anyway, thanks for asking, though.
But the researchers are interested in talking with me more about how can we start to look at that differently. But that idea that I have been thinking about for many, many years, having some scientific rigor behind it and having some academic rigor behind it, I think could be the next step in trying to change the way that we look at competition and think about competition in a different way. Because I think that's also a part of this solution, is that we're addressing the patriarchy, we're addressing the gender binary, but we're also addressing what does it mean to compete? Can we look at competition in a way that is a bit more holistic and more healthy? And that it's not just about, I'm better than you and you are worse than me. But can we have different levels, different ideas of competing in ways that match especially where kids are at in their developmental stage? And this is helpful, drum roll, to cisgender boys too. Like, not every cisgender boy is a hardcore competitive athlete. And so giving that space for the boys to be able to have a space that's like, yeah, this is a better pace for me. This is a better speed for me. These are the kids that I want to play with. And not just like, you're a 12-year-old boy, you must be, as competitive as these other 12-year-old boys. I think that's a part of opening this spectrum and this idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's laughable, right? Because elite sport particularly is all about biological advantage. That's kind of what makes them elite. Like, Brianna Stewart has a 7'1" wingspan. I do not. Brianna Stewart has a biological advantage over me when it comes to basketball. And like, I'm sorry. But I mean, fairness is also money. Do you have access to good coaching? What kind of equipment do you have? Do you have parents that can drive you to practices, right? Like, Kaig, you know this. You have worked in trying to get access for like lower income communities and things. Those are also advantages. And they impact like what is fair and what is not. And so I think we boil this down to like such in my opinion, quite a dehumanizing conversation, because when we focus on, well, what hormones, someone has, what their genitals might be, what their chromosomes are, we're reducing them to like their body parts instead of looking at them as like holistic humans. And I think sometimes like there's a conversation to be had, right, when we're talking about kids versus, elite Olympic level athletes, and whether there need to be different kinds of scientific and evidence-based research that come in, sure. But at its heart, like, the Olympic Charter actually says that access to sport free from discrimination is in the Olympic Charter. Any sort of sex testing has been deemed a human rights abuse by the United Nations. So I find so often we get in these conversations with people who want to argue about testosterone levels or, what sex someone is assigned at birth. And I kind of just want to be like, we're having the wrong conversation because we're actually talking about human beings who have a right to fully live in this world and have access to the things that everybody else does and shouldn't be denied that just based on, who they are or what their identity is. And so I think reshaping the conversation too, like, yes, there's absolutely a need to have more research. The research we do have actually shows that trans women probably don't have an advantage over cis women and in some cases have a disadvantage. More of that, please. That's really important. But I also think recentering the conversation on the actual athletes and like people who are just trying to play sport, at whatever level that is really, really important. Because I think when you start to dehumanize someone and reduce them to their body parts, you actually lose the stakes. And it's a lot easier to, I think, be exclusionary and discriminatory because you don't actually see the person at the center of it.
Frankie, oh my God, Kaig, I will jump in now, y'all. Like this, you see me biting my lip and stuff. I've wanted to give you guys the mic because it's so rich. I wrote up all these questions and now like, these are like not even relevant and or have already been addressed. And so I can't think about it in the way that you do because of the areas of expertise and experience and research. It's so rich. I'm going to throw out a couple myths that maybe people have that we want to debunk right now. And I've heard them all over sports over time. Oh, trans people just are saying they're trans so they can have that advantage. That's the reason why they're identifying that way, so that they can like be better in the competitive environment. I see heads shaking. This is real. I've heard and seen this. How do you respond to this, in my opinion, ignorant statement about the full on, anyway, don't get me started. What is your response to something like this, guys?
I mean, can someone show me one person that's ever done that? Because the toll that, particularly if we're talking about people who are assigned male at birth, transitioning and taking feminizing hormones, if you're actually not trans, I mean, I can't imagine. I don't know a single cisgender man that would be very happy to go through a rigorous hormonal transition just to be able to play sport for what? There's no money in women's sports either. What money are you winning? There's no money. There's no prestige. I don't know what the motivation would be, but I also has anyone ever produced evidence of a single time that it's happened?
Yet it's a judgment and a stereotype and a thought that people have. It's just so, Kaig, what is your, yeah, go ahead, Frankie.
I was just going to say if they want that badly, okay, sure.
Yeah, go through something that is so horrifically challenging just to win a sport. It's such a bizarre argument. And I feel like it's just an argument that's rooted just in fear. It's just
totally.
And it's something, I think it's something that's an easy, low-hanging fruit thing for people who aren't willing to look at this in any particularly positive way, that they're just kind of yeah, let's get on the negative train. Let's just look at all the things about this. And it's sure, that makes sense. Somebody fakes their way into women's sport to take an advantage. Okay, that seems yeah, why wouldn't somebody do that? That it's this mentality of, it's just the binary, y'all. It's just the binary. It's so rooted in all of our conditioning that for people who are really against this and are really anti-trans, they see that as yeah, that makes sense. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you want to take that advantage, right? But of course, it's so preposterous that it boggles all of our minds. But the other side of this argument thinks it's completely realistic because, to your point, Frankie, trans people are not real people to those folks. Those folks who are anti-trans, we are not real actors. We are not people who have lives and pay bills and go to the grocery store and raise children and have struggles, right? And have joys. We are not those full, all-encompassing people. We are genitals and we are a condition. That's it. That's what we are to those folks. And so if that's all you are, then of course you can make the argument of yeah, you're already completely deranged in the head. Why wouldn't you be so deranged as to go and try and take over women's sport?
right? And it's very rooted in the trans misogyny of the fear mongering around trans women which we've already talked about, how anti-trans people try to say that trans women are just, quote unquote, biological men. I don't use that term. That is always
right.
Ever hear biological man, biological woman, that is a transphobia alarm should be going off for you. But the idea that trans women are just men in a dress is why you have this argument at all. It makes them seem predatory. It makes them seem like men who are just looking for a way to enter women's spaces so that they can prey on them or harm them or assault them in the locker room, right? All of those arguments are tied up in this one sort of preposterous myth. It comes from a very dangerous belief.
Yes. Thank you for adding all of that. It is so important because we've had a depth of a continuum of understanding of the trans experience, the trans voices, and in sport. Like, we've covered a very high and deep level of understanding. Some of my listeners, our listeners here at Making Moves, may or may not know a lot of these things. So this is just so darn rich. What can cisgender men, cis women and girls do to be strong allies and supporters of what we're talking about? I mean, you both have said very eloquently that they are the crux of what can give us hope and a little bit of positivity here, but the systems are separating them and splintering them off. Okay. And what can someone like myself do? What can listeners, the young people who are listening, do to help this conversation and this movement and challenge the politics? Because that's another way of dehumanizing, right? What can we do, from your opinion?
I'll jump in. To me, allyship across all identities, we don't need to just keep this to just trans allyship, but allyship is taking a risk. If you are somebody who considers yourself an ally to a community that you are not a part of, that you're not a member of, then you likely have some more privilege than people in that community.
Correct.
Right? So to be an ally, I think, is to then recognize, where can I use that privilege that I have to take a little bit of a risk? And sometimes that risk can be, speaking up and speaking out for someone that can't because it's too much of a danger to them. It can look like a lot of different ways that you take that risk, but that risk for you as an ally may be very, very, very less significant than a risk that somebody like myself is taking as a trans person, particularly now, right?
Yep.
The baddest thing I want to do right now that is deep in my soul, I want to be up on the biggest public stage that I possibly can be, to say, I am a trans person. I am a successful, joyful, healthy, smart, accomplished trans person, because I want that message to go through. But I'm not doing that right now because the federal government's shit out of it.
Yeah. Yep.
I can't do that right now. So I need people who are not going to be at a threat to their lives and their livelihood, to say those things, to say the trans community and people within the larger LGBTQ community, quite frankly, are successful, joyful, healthy people who deserve every bit that everyone else does in this country. And that is where we need allies to be showing up, because we can't do it as much as we want to right now.
Kaig, before I get to Frankie, what are like 2 concrete ways that someone can do that? Because I know there's many like, okay, how, where, what do I do? Where do I go? What do you think we do?
It's going to look different to everybody, but it could be as much as it could be as simple as you're in a conversation with people within your community and someone says something like, I don't know how I feel about trans women in sport. Even as simple as that, you could be the person that steps in and says, hey, let's talk about that some more. You can do it as much as saying, you know what? I also am not totally sure. Let's have a conversation. I just heard this podcast. I just heard all these things. Let's talk about it. Go listen to that podcast. Go listen to other trans people talk about being in sport. Be the person that keeps the conversation going for us. So you could do it as simple as a one-on-one or a small group, or you could write about it. You could put it on social media. You could be loud and big and bold about it. I think those are 2 different ways you can show up.
Thanks, Kaig. Thank you so much. Frankie?
Well, yeah, I was going to say that I think we often think of allyship and advocacy as having to be this big, gesture, but it doesn't have to be, and it starts in your community. So I think I would challenge people to look around and see what their own connections are in their own neighborhood, their own community, your kids' schools, your kids' teams. Do you play a club sport? Any of those places are like great places to start. And even just as much as to say, like, hey, if your kid is in a league or you play a club sport, to just say, like, hey, I noticed on our social media pages, we've never posted about this. And I think it might be really helpful if we put up a post letting folks know that, like, we support trans folks playing sports and that this is a safe place for them, or whatever it is. Those are concrete things that can happen on like a very local level, and they don't have to be as big. But it is really important. I think something that I like to point out, because a lot of people don't realize this, is Idaho was the first state to have trans sports ban. And when that was challenged in court on the ACLU case, there was a cisgender collegiate athlete as a Jane Doe on that case, because she recognized that policing the gender of trans, feminine athletes also put her in danger. And so she actually joined that case and is part of it. And a lot of people don't realize that that there's actually a cisgender, athlete on that case. I always think that that's a really important thing to point out, to kind of like show this is a way, like, yes, it concerns her too, but she's also putting her neck out, right? She's graduated by now. It's not going to affect her, but she put her neck out anyway. And I think that that's really important. And you can do a big thing like that, but you can also do something much smaller and closer to home. And all of those things matter.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think you're talking about deferring the privilege that we have, and the risk. In my opinion, the small risk is a risk to take that trans folks and a lot of people in the LGBTQIA plus have to deal with every day of their lives. Every day of your lives, there's a risk for being in your truth. What are some heartfelt, in your opinion, statements you can say here at the end that people can leave with and be really like, I want to think about that some more? I think you've said so much, both of you today, about the humanizing, the fear, the grief of what this can entail, those deeper emotions, that part just really sticks with me, like dumbing down the human experience to policies, policing, body parts is just so horrific. What would you want people to be sitting with and being like, that's something I need to think about when we are within the trans community, within the LGBTQIA plus community, and not? What would be something that you'd want them to think about? Yes, Frankie.
Something that's very heartening for me, because I think right now it is very scary, and we see it all seems to be happening at once, right? It's like a deluge of, anti-trans, whether it's policies or rhetoric, it just kind of seems to be everywhere. Something that I try to do in my reporting is actually trace a lot of for me, it's in sports, but the anti-trans rhetoric in sport back to like where it's coming from. And it feels really big and it feels like it's everywhere. But the reality is that it is very few voices that are actually orchestrating a lot of this. It's like a handful of groups. It is a really small minority that has managed to be very, very vocal and make it seem like, quote unquote, everybody feels this way about trans people and trans athletes. The reality is they don't. Actually, most people either are supportive or don't know enough to really have a formed opinion, but they're not bigots, they just don't know. And so, like, I literally just looked at this weekend with the Boston Marathon, because there was all of this media about a trans woman competing in the Boston Marathon. I traced every single headline about that to one group, to one transphobic, anti-trans advocacy group that had managed to completely dominate the coverage. And it is always the same few names that I come back to over and over again. It's the same group. All the anti-trans, bills banning, trans kids from youth sports were all written by the Alliance Defending Freedom, pretty much. Almost all of them are written by the same conservative Christian lobby. There's a story in Mother Jones that actually looks at all of that. And so for me, when I feel really afraid, I try to remember that these are just people who have managed to be very good at PR for a really crappy issue, but that they are the minority. And my hope is that in the long run, we will be able to outnumber and overtake them, even though I know it can feel really scary right now. And that is really real, and I don't want to minimize that either.
Thank you for that, Frankie. That's really informative. Thank you for that.
Frankie, that was just helpful for me to hear. That's like
right,
because it feels like it's coming from every direction right now in a way that I've never experienced before. My final message is really coming from the human side of things. I'm real relationship based. I'm real relational. I love people. I love getting to know people. And I think if more people got to know me and other trans folks and got to know who we are and the kind of people that we are and how amazing we all are, that there would be a shift in this understanding and this fear and this hate. But the reality is that there's so few of us that are known. We're out there, we're everywhere. Trans people have been around forever, but there's so few of us that are known, and our humanity isn't known. And there's an assumption that there's very, very few of us. That percentage keeps getting thrown around of like, oh, there's only 1% of trans people in the United States. I'm like, that is some BS, y'all, because we are not a part of the census. I am not counted in the census. There's nothing about my gender identity that's considered, that's asked in the census. So nobody actually knows how many trans folks are out there. Transgender identity comes in all kinds of shapes and forms. But the thing that I want to leave all of you with is that sport saved my life. If I had not had sport and the ability to run out all of my anxiety and all of my hate and all of my fear and all of the emotions that I was having because I was bullied every single day of my life, if I did not have sport to go to, I would not be here. We have to have sport accessible for everybody, all identities, coming from every single experience in this life, because it is the thing that can save somebody's life. It can continue their ability to move on into the next day. It allowed me to get up every morning and say, I can make it through this day because I know I have XYZ practice at the end of the day, or I get to go and do this exercise or this workout. That saved my entire life. And the fact that we are trying to take something life-saving away from kids is unconscionable. And we cannot stand for it at all. And so that's where we need allies to really show up, because this is more than just a sport. This is an existence that can change somebody's life. And so that's what I want to leave people with.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your hearts, your humanity, letting people get to know you, your areas of expertise. I learned a lot today. I know people are going to walk away with, I need to listen to that again. I need to pause, rewind. I need to hear that again. Thank you for contributing to the Making Moves podcast today, and I'll let Andrea take it out for us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our guests, Kaig Lightner and Frankie de la Cretaz, for their bold truth-telling today, and to our host, Lisa Bonta Sumii, for guiding so many crucial conversations that happen on Making Moves. I'd like you to check out the show notes for links to our guests' projects and their writing, and to make sure to follow and share our podcast. We truly, truly appreciate your support. We also truly appreciate our sponsor, the Center for Sport and Social Justice at Cal State East Bay, as well as our technical producers, Sports eMedia. Next time is our final episode for this season of Making Moves. And you're going to hear from students at Castlemont High School who are literally designing the future of Oakland, or at least the Coliseum and the arena, where some people have seen a ton of loss and devastation and brokenness. These students are laying the foundations for a huge comeback. Their proposals include green walking trails, farmers markets, third spaces for community healing, vibrant business hubs, and they are truly honoring the soul of the town centered around sports. Until then, stay active, stay questioning, and keep making moves.